Welcome to the studio. In this video, we're going to start bringing our snowman to life. We're going to work on some of the elements, the hat and the scarf, maybe even some of the cardinal. Now, all of those elements will really help us start to be able to judge any further changes we want to make when we start adding some highlights to the snowman. So get comfortable, grab something warm to drink, and let's have fun painting. So I'm going to open up my palette. I just have my plate in a Ziploc. So I'll pull it out and we'll start to get ready to paint a little bit more. I'm going to grab, well, let's start with the number 6 filbert. And I think I'm going to start painting the hat. At the end of the first video, I mentioned that I thought for this part we would start on the snowman. And during my break of giving the dogs their lunch and thinking about it, I realized that it might be better to lay in some of these other details first so that we can get a good view of how everything is coming together. Color is so relational, and making too many changes too early to the snowman can mean we have to do more edits later. So always be willing to shift your ideas and do something a little bit differently. I'm going to start out with some black. I just put out a little bit of the carbon black on my palette. And I might actually go ahead, since we've got some phthalo blue still here, I might dip into that and let that mix in a little bit. It just livens up our black a little bit. And I'm just going to start to base this into our snowman. This littler brush really does give us a little bit more control, and we can just take our time and run it along that line to start to paint the hat in. Remember, if you make a mistake here and you get outside of the area that we are wanting the hat to be, don't panic. We can always come back in and adjust the background a little bit. It's one of those things that one of those places where having the limited palette really comes in handy. We know we can mix that color again because there's so few colors. Everything is going to go together, come together in the end because of our limited palette. And mixing the exact right color was always something when I first started out painting that I really stressed about. The reality is that if the color is a little bit different, that's kind of good. It's good to have those variations. I'm going to turn my round over a little bit. It's a little bit easier for me to paint up to a line rather than paint down to a line, if that makes sense. I don't have to worry too much at the center band because we're going to come in with paint there. You'll sometimes have a little bit more control if you really press down, use the full brush. So you see there, really pressing down onto the belly of the brush and then pushing the paint along that line. It's much easier to really press down than it is to try to have light pressure. Hopefully that kind of makes sense. So that looks pretty good. I think that I will, while that's still a little bit damp, I'll come back in and do a little shine on the hat. So just a little bit of that phthalo blue Here's a little bit of the titanium white that we had before, and I'll just run a line of color right there. And then on my towel, I can go ahead and get most of the paint out of my brush. I forgot to open my airbrush medium. So I can dip into the airbrush medium and then come back in with a mostly clean brush and just run it along that paint. If it gets too light, then we just add in a little bit more. The more times that you go back and forth, the more interesting that this little shine can look. If you have trouble with it, there's nothing at all wrong with letting it dry, letting this black part dry, and then coming back in for a shine on the hat. So it's just subtle, just a little hint there. We might do a little bit more later, but sometimes adding in some of those little details like that right now reminds me when I get closer to the end of the painting that I wanted a shine there. It's easy when you get to the end of the painting to forget what you had planned to do. My brush just had a little bit too much of the airbrush medium in it there. That's why you can see it being so transparent here. That's okay, I can just come back over it, paint over it again, and if I need to let it dry, I can do that too. If you want to move to a little bit of a smaller brush, if a smaller brush helps you feel like you have more control, certainly be willing to do that. It's easy as you're painting to struggle for a while and not take the time to just switch brushes. Try not to let yourself do that. And the opposite is also true. If things are working really well, don't change the brush, because that's going to change a lot of things, that how your hand is moving and all of that. So I do that so much. I get in a hurry and don't just take the time to switch brushes. And it's a kind of a silly mistake to make, because you end up, struggling and not having fun with what you're doing. So there's our hat, very easily based in. We might have to come back in and do another coat, but as always, we're going to let this sit and make a decision about whether or not we want to come back in after it dries a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and clean my brush a little bit, just dip it in the airbrush medium and blot it out on my towel until it's mostly clean. And let's go ahead and pull in some red. I'm going to put out a little bit of the naphthol red light. I'm sorry, this is pyrrole red. I have both. I have naphthol red and pyrrole in my heavy body. So pyrrole red light, I've got out a little bit of the quinacridone magenta. And I think that what I'll do is start on the scarf. Since the black is still a little bit damp, rather than risking pulling any of that in, we can just move down to the scarf. I'm going to keep in mind again that the light source is coming from the top right. So I want my scarf to be brighter on this right edge. I think that I'm going to start with just straight pyrrole red for the start of this scarf, and I might actually change to a different, I think I'm going to go ahead and change to a smaller brush, at least for a little while. Whenever you get out a new brush, just get it damp so it loosens those bristles up. You can get it damp in the airbrush medium. I just want to take my time getting over that edge where that lasered line is for the art. And I'll let it be quite bright up here on this fold over of the scarf. I like to hold my piece to turn it. If you don't like to hold your piece, leaving it flat on your table is perfectly fine. And now I think that I'll start to add in a little bit of the quinacridone, just brush mixing a little bit between the two piles. I guess you can't really pull that over so it shows on the screen. You can see that it's very loosely mixed. I like to not over mix my paints when I'm color mixing on the palette. I'm going to pick up a little bit of the phthalo blue, and a lot of times I touch it on the palette like this just to get a little bit of it out. You can see how strong that color is. That just helps me get even a little bit of a darker color for this shadow area of the scarf. You could also add in a little bit of the burnt sienna if you wanted to darken that red. If you feel like it just, it just got too purple. But I kind of like that, the way that that's looking. And now you can see I just dipped into the pyrrole red again, and I'm just going back between those two colors to pull it together a little bit. And as almost always, I didn't wash my brush out at all. I like having those colors, kind of play together. And sometimes you have like a little bit of a happy accident. I have a puppy hair on my palette. When some colors come out of your brush unexpectedly, it's kind of like, oh, that looked kind of pretty. I can come back in with a little bit more of the straight red. And then go over again this area where there was a little bit more of the quinacridone and the blue. If we decide later that it's just a little bit too dark at the bottom, we can certainly lighten it up again, but I kind of am liking how that's looking. And again here, the brush direction, the direction of your brush stroke matters. So following the shape of the scarf really helps to build that form. I'm going to let it get a little bit darker up underneath of his chin here. You certainly don't have to do that much detail. It's fine as it is without that, but keeping in mind the shadows and building the shape really is kind of fun to do. So as the paint was running out of my brush there, I'm just kind of going back over those paint strokes just to pull the colors together a little bit. Mostly I'm looking for not a blend necessarily, but a soft transition between the colors. Add a little bit more of the blue. Some of your paint colors are more transparent than others. You can always tell by looking um, at your bottle to see. Trying to get my fingers here so you can see. Do you see this open box here on the quinacridone magenta? That means that that color is a very transparent color. On the pyrrole red, you can see that the box is half filled, so it's not quite as transparent as that quinacridone magenta. And the reason that I'm saying that here is you'll see it behave a little bit differently even as you paint it on to the surface of your piece. I have a little bit more of that dark on my brush than I want, so I'm just going to wipe it off and then come back with some pure pyrrole red and just go between those colors to pull it all together. I'm going to go ahead and let that dry. I am going to come back and restate that brightest red later. Sorry, I keep hitting the microphone over here. Um, but I'm going to let it dry first. I don't want to bother it too much at this stage. So let's start to do these folds of the scarf. We'll let this back one, oops, it slipped in my hand. We'll let this back one get a little bit darker. That happens to me so much as I'm painting, just the little fumbles that you do. The worst is like dropping the paintbrush. I get so relaxed with the paintbrush in my hand that I just drop it on my piece. Let's come back in. I just wiped the brush out on my towel, and I'm going to come in with the bright red for this top fold. And make sure that I do a nice edge over here. On some of my pieces, I like to paint around the edge. For this one, there's so many different shapes going on that I didn't want to complicate it by taking the scarf over the edge over here. Now I can bring a little bit of the pyrrole red into this darker area back here. And clean out the brush mostly, and then just run the mostly clean brush between those two colors. Created a little bit more of a actual line than I wanted, so I'm going to come back with the pyrrole red again, just go over that a little bit. Now we can add a little bit of shadow to this front. And I'm kind of just going to give it a little bit of motion actually, just using a little bit of that darker color that we mixed, coming back in with the pyrrole red and bringing the colors together just a little bit. You can see you can be real loose with this at this point. It doesn't have to be, it doesn't need to be perfect, and we really don't, you know, when our brush strokes are looser, the piece feels more comfortable to anybody who's viewing it. So I just added a little bit of detail. I'm going to come back and fix this edge a little bit so that I can make sure all the wood is nicely covered. And I want to do the same up here, just fix this edge. It's a little bit hard sometimes with the wood texture, just tap it in until it fills that in. I got a little bit dark, so I'll tap into the pyrrole red again. That's pretty good. Let's go ahead and do the hat. So again, keeping in mind our light source, I'll have this side of the band be a little bit brighter. And I'm not worried about painting over those berries because we're going to be making them reddish too anyway, so they will still show up. Those etch lines will still show up even if you paint over it. In fact, I'm going to purposefully paint over it just because at this point it's a little bit easier to fill in some of that engraved mark than to try to do it later. I'm going to dip into a little bit of the airbrush medium, tap a little bit of it out so I don't have too much, just to help my paint flow a little bit better across the surface. Getting my hand in the scarf a little bit. Let's go ahead and pick up a little bit of our darker. Again, remember the darker that I have here is the quinacridone magenta, a little bit of the phthalo blue. It's got a little bit of the pyrrole red because that's in my brush as well. Let it get a little bit darker at the bottom of this, or the rim of the hat band, not the rim, the bottom edge of this like ribbon on the hat band. And now I'll dip into the pyrrole red and just start to bring those colors together a little bit. Letting it get a little bit brighter up here at the top since our light source is up at the top. So you can see how easily we can pull those colors together just by going back and forth between the pyrrole red and that darker red color that we've mixed. I just blotted out the brush. I'll come back into the pyrrole red again just to soften that transition between those two colors. If you feel like you need to soften it more, dip into the airbrush medium again, blot it out, clean your brush a little bit, get most of the airbrush medium out, and then just wipe between those colors. I just dipped into the Pyrrole Red again. I like some of those highlights that are happening. You see some of these highlights that are coming in. When you start to see some of that, don't overbrush the piece. Let some of those streaks stay and happen. I feel like I can see just a little bit of the wood here, so I'm just going to touch that up a little bit. It's one of those things, as an artist, I'm always watching. When something really interesting happens, always be ready to stop. Always be ready to not keep adding more paint. I was just looking for a smaller brush here. Here is a teeny tiny size 0 filbert. And like I mentioned in the part 1 of this class, these brushes that I'm using are very, very inexpensive for a full set of brushes. And I really like to use the very inexpensive brushes because I'm not very careful. I'm always scrubbing around with my brushes, and it's nice to just it's nice to not have to be careful. So I'm just tapping into these circles just to lay the first color of the berries in. So I used that darkest color there, that quinacridone magenta and phthalo blue, and then I can just come in and dot some red highlights along the side. I can even make a little bit of a pinker color, grab some titanium white and just mix it into the edge. Always when I mix, I have these variations of color, and I love being able to go back to my palette and have those variations of colors to choose from. So I'm just going to tap along the edge of these. And that's really fine. They don't need anything more than that. If you want to come back in after it's dry and do more, you certainly can, but that's really, really good where it is there. I'm going to go ahead and rinse out my brush just a little bit because I want to go to some white, and we'll set in the main shape of his eyes. So I'm going to start with just pure white. Anytime you wipe out your brush, anytime you wash it in your water, make sure that you get the ferrule dried or it will drip on your piece. So for the eyes, I'm going to just tap in and fill this whole eye shape. So I don't have to do a brush stroke particularly. I can just tap it and fill in that whole circle part of his eye. I was trying to decide if I wanted to do anything else as far as like a black line over the top. I might do like kind of a gray line maybe. So it's not, you know, stark black. If you have an acrylic pen, you can certainly use a pen. So I set in that gray line. I'm just going to go back and tap back in with the white just to push it back into shape. I think that while I'm here, I'm going to go ahead and do the mouth as well. So I'm just going to thin down the paint a little bit more with the airbrush medium. That's going to help the paint flow a little bit. And I'm going to come in and set in this mouth. It's a very fine line, and we don't have to worry because we haven't finished the snowman yet, and we're going to be able to reshape this eye when we come back in with the highlights. So we don't have to have it perfect. Don't worry about it being perfect. Good. While I have this black, I might as well go ahead and tap into the cardinal's face here. This is a pretty tiny little area, so again, just tapping your brush can really give you enough of that, enough of the paint there in that little tiny area. And his eye is back there. Again, it's tiny. We're not going to do a lot with his eye. What we can do if you're worried about forgetting his eye, same thing that I talked about with the highlight on the snowman hat. If we want to, we can come back and just do a little tiny dot just in his eye. So I'm just gonna just touch, and it'll probably be bigger than I want it to be. It actually didn't turn out too bad. Let's see if I can show you. The camera won't focus on it. I'll show it up close in a little bit. It really doesn't need a whole lot more than that. I think maybe the snowman's eyes are dry enough that I can come touch back in with the black in those. So same principle as the cardinal eye. We're just going to tap it in. This brush has a little bit of a frayed edge, so I'm dealing with that a little bit. He looks good. It's fun how a piece comes to life a little bit when you get the eyes in. I'm going to tap just around the edge just to fix the pupil a little bit. You can go back and forth, adding in the light, adding in the black until you have it the way that you like it. Good. I'm going to leave that set for now. I'm going to let that dry, and then we'll come back in and add some little catch lights, and I'll tell you a little secret that I like to do with the eyes on my pieces a lot of times. Let's go ahead and mix up some orange. Of course, we're going to need orange for the carrot on his nose. I'm going to also do a little bit of orange for the cardinal. You know, just for some highlights. So let's go ahead and bring out a little bit of the Hansa Yellow Opaque. I just need a drop. And I'm just going to mix it in with the red a little bit. Just get a nice orange color. And I have a little bit of black in my brush still, which is giving me kind of a muddy color. So I'm just going to move over to the side and mix again. Still dealing with this tiny little hair in my brush. So again, the same idea with the light source. So we want his little nose here to be a little bit lighter on the top, and then get a little bit darker as it comes to the bottom. I can come down to this muddy color that I mixed by accident earlier, add a little bit of quinacridone magenta to darken it. You can also add a little bit of phthalo blue. Of course, phthalo blue and orange are complementary colors, so adding a little bit of phthalo will tone that color down. Maybe I will add just a touch of the phthalo. You can see how crazy strong the phthalo is. I'm just going to touch in just a little bit of shadow, and then go ahead and blot out the brush and come back in and touch into that. I say settle it in a lot. I hope that that makes sense. It just kind of, just touching it with the brush just brings it together a little bit. We can lighten it up a little bit more for the top if you want to, spend extra time on it. So again, just kind of touching it. Let's quickly do a little bit on the cardinal, and then I think that we will end part one. I'm going to start with a little bit of the orange, and you can see as it comes off, I hope you can see as it comes off on the piece that there's lots of colors. It's not fully mixed, so you can see some areas that are a little bit more red, some areas that are a little bit more orange. I'm going to need a little bit more of the Pyro Red. This is one of the nice things about the fluid acrylics. You can easily open the little tab, put out a little bit of the color. I keep getting out of the camera view a little bit. I should have done his little beak while I had the orange in my brush. I'm going to use a little bit more of the quinacridone magenta down at this bottom area, the shadow side of him. Dip back into the Pyro Red to bring those together. Back to the shadow for underneath of the wing. And I'll do a little bit of this. This is mostly quinacridone magenta on my brush here. Just a little bit of it on his tail. My paint is drying there a little bit. On your palette, wherever the paint is really thin, like it is here where I've been mixing, that's going to dry faster than other areas. And that's completely fine. Just remix a little bit. I'll do a little bit of shadow in the wing here. Get most of that out of my brush and go back to the Pyro Red and just brush over that area again. Since it's still wet, it will mix right as I'm painting. I have a little bit of that dark in my brush, so I'm going to bring a little bit of that up into the crest here, just so I can stroke back through it and give a little hint of the feathering. Like I said, he's really tiny there. Back to the pyrrole red. I kind of want a little bit more dark up here just to be able to stroke through it with the red. Give a little bit of the hint of the that crest there. So just work back and forth between the colors. Let's see, I think I'm going to thin out this red just a little bit so I can come back in and do just a little bit up here by his crest. And then a little bit more orange. And then I'll settle that back in again with a little bit of the pyrrole red. So I hope that you can see as you go back and forth between those colors how really pretty you can paint him in. Let's quickly go ahead and give him a little hint of a beak here. You can certainly do more with a shadow. You really don't have to. It's just so tiny right there. Just trying to make a little bit of a darker color with that orange and quinacridone magenta and a tiny bit of phthalo blue. So I just kind of touched it in, and then I'll go back and touch it again with the orange. Yeah, he's cute. Let's end part 2 here. I think that we have a great start on him. Really, at this point, the hard part is over. We'll come back in and, of course, finish the highlights on his body and do the little pine on his hat, and then just a little hint of the cardinal legs, and this piece will be done. So I look forward to seeing you in part 3. Part 3 is linked below, so click that link and I'll meet you there.